something that stuck with me the other day when I covered the Ben Shapiro video, right? We covered Ben Shapiro's piss poor reception of Elliot Page and coming out as like transgender. And so as I was talking about it, a troll came into chat and was like complaining about me not properly addressing Ben Shapiro's arguments. And I was like, you know what? There is, to an extent, a truth there where I am saying that I use facts and to back up my positions, and I haven't really dove into like facts related to like sex and gender in like the scientific community, right? Um, this is largely because I feel like it's very simple and demonstrably true that sex and gender are two different things. But if we want to go into like a more scientific approach to these things, that I feel like that's actually a more reasonable ask than most trolls that come through here. Now, granted, that person also did like misgender me and was incredibly rude, and generally, I think that their complaints had very little merit. But I figured, you know what? Even though they're banned and they're never coming back, it's worth talking about, right? Let's take a look at where science lies on this topic. You know, Ben Shapiro in his video likes to claim that he's on the side of facts and logic and science, and that's not true. It's not true. Not true. So let's go into why it's not true. Let's take a look, shall we? So, first off, we have the American Medical Association here. A letter from the editor from back in 2008. So 12 years ago. We've had a pretty good understanding that sex and gender are different things and why recognizing them as such has benefits, especially when it comes to practicing medicine. So let's take a look. The Mars versus Venus distinction is commonly used to refer to the age-old dialogue over the differences between men and women, differences that undoubtedly will be pondered, researched, and challenged for lifetimes to come. The subject of sex and gender difference is now advancing with renewed vigor to the forefront of the study and practice of medicine. Just as it has long been known that children are not miniature adults, there is increasing focus on how the differences between the sexes affect how illnesses are diagnosed, run their course, and respond to treatment. First, though, it is necessary to point out that the terms sex and gender are not synonyms. Sex refers to the biological differences between males and females. Gender refers to the continuum of complex psychosocial self-perceptions, attitudes, and expectations people have made about members of both sexes. Even the terms male and female, man and woman are not interchangeable. What it means to be male or female originates from physical characteristics derived from sex chromosomes and genes that lead to certain gonads, internal and external genitalia, and physiological hormones. Being a man or woman holds broader meaning, with cultural concepts of masculinity and femininity coming into play. This issue of virtual mentor will not focus so much on why sex and gender should not be used interchangeably, but instead on how sex and gender together and to varying degrees influence today's practice of medicine. So again, this is not from a letter from the editor regarding this exact issue. It's just touching on the fact that this is a widely accepted and understood way of understanding that there is a difference between sex and gender, and that understanding that difference is what can lead us to better medical outcomes. So on a practical level, understanding that sex and gender are different is incredibly important. The letter goes on to basically talk about differences and like how people choose their physicians varies based on gender rather than sex, and how like understanding these things is very crucial and affects your levels of care. Yeah. So Again, this is a pretty good just like a case study of why recognizing a difference between sex and gender is really, really important. But of course, that's not the only thing I have here to talk about. Is Revolt Rise here? Oh, Revolt Rise isn't here. Darn it. All right. Now we have Pacific Center for Sex and Society, titled Sex and Gender, Same or Different, authored by Milton Diamond, published in Feminism and Psychology back in 2000. Pretty cool. This is some vintage understanding. Even older. We have a 20-year-old study here, or rather essay, I guess. Basically, taking a look at a bunch of data, you recognize that there are differences here. Let's see here. As a designation of male or female sex, with the child's increasing sophistication and learning, becomes understood as a descriptive set of terms and meanings that encompass the most common biologically accepted attributes, physical differences of males and females. The terms imply certain gonads, internal and external genitalia, sex chromosomes and genes, sex hormones, and so on. The student learns that a male is an individual that has a penis and scrotum, testes, associated glands, prostate, seminal vesicles, bulbourethral glands, and a female is a person with ovaries, a uterus, ovarian tubes, etc., etc. An intersexed individual is understood to have a mixture of these attributes. And these basic understandings hold for the term sex as they did for the terms dad and mom. Wide variations and departures from the basic generalities can be known without nullifying the common wisdom. The term gender first became familiar to most of us in language class when, for those of us with English as a common tongue, we learned that nouns such as table and chair could be either masculine, feminine, or neuter. Of what use are such distinctions still remains lost on linguists. While language as different as French and German need these artifices, while English and most Australo-Asian languages, for instance, can get along quite well without them, is subject for thought. Many languages do not even have sex-identifying pronouns, but understanding of gender or sex-typical behaviors, the older expression for gender-specific traits, serves quite practical use, and no known language is known without gender-identifying nouns. General usage of the term gender began in the late 1960s and 1970s, increasingly appearing in the professional literature of social sciences. The term came to be used serve useful purpose in distinguishing those aspects of life that were more easily attributed or understood to be of social rather than biological origin. Interesting. Males and females as biological entities were accepted as essentially similar cross-culturally, but men and women, by virtue of the multitude of different roles they've played in diversified societies, were not so easily cataloged. These anthropological lifestyle differences came to be accepted as social and cultural constructs. Indeed, the terms sex and gender came, for most investigators, to signify and reify these different areas of consideration. Sex would refer to biological traits, while gender would refer to social/cultural ones. At least this was generally so among the investigators more sensitive to biological studies. Literally, what this essay is talking about is how people who are more involved in biology are more prone to understand the differences between sex and gender. So literally what this essay is talking about is that people who know more in the biological field tend to understand better that there is a difference between sex and gender. So when Ben Shapiro goes on a video and says he's talking about the science, actually he's not. He's actually not talking about the science, because if he was, he would know that there is a distinction that he continually fails to make, either because he's stupid, or because he is willfully ignorant, or because he knows better and just knows that his base wants him to shit on trans people. It's one of those three things. So the rest of the essay here is basically talking about the existence of like trans people and transsexual people, as well as a whole host of other things. It's actually pretty interesting to read. Um, Let's see. Among those more aligned with sociological and anthropological thinking, these differences did not appear to be so clear-cut. For this latter group, the terms sex and gender were often used interchangeably. Again, this is an essay from 2000 and talking about kind of the history of this distinction. In 1978, Kessler and McKenna, in their now classic work, challenged how the relationship between sex and gender might be considered. They even challenged if the two concepts were different or interchangeable. In just so story fashion, the fact that males and females are sexually, biologically different is what leads to the gender differences seen and manifested by men and women in their behavior patterns and roles. It is certainly understood that by the majority of the lay public as well as many scientists. But, questioned Kessler and McKenna, if this were so clear-cut, why do transsexuals in their pursuit of the lifestyle of the opposite sex work so hard in trying to prove to the outside world what they feel they are on the inside? In doing so, Kessler and McKenna point out that transsexuals, again, aged language, seek to reconstruct their sex to coincide with their psychological gender. Doesn't this imply that it is their gender which is primary and their sex secondary? Analysis of the thinking of transsexuals is simultaneously used as a foil to bolster the McKenna-Kessler argument that the study of gender benefits from insightful and detailed analysis of the thinking of individuals as they make significant gender-related decisions. This is part of the ethno-methodological approach they espouse. So, again, basically this is saying, okay, we understand this in terms of like cisgender people, but how does it apply to transgender people? In demonstrating their point, Kessler and McKenna take the rhetorically clever position of accepting that transsexuals are what they say they are. They interviewed 15 transsexual individuals. I'm going to skip this section because it is very aged. To rectify the dichotomy, the transsexual is seen as not wanting to change gender, but change genitals and body. It thus appears that sex is variable and gender is invariant, a reversal from the way the two had come to be considered. But the transsexual, according to our authors, then sets about learning or perfecting how to be the man or woman of mind's desire. In so doing, the transsexual proves to Kessler and McKenna that gender is a construction that doesn't necessarily follow from anatomy. Boom! Oh, quick question. I always saw the term transsexual as a cold, technical term rather than having a moral weight. What's the term typically used in academic papers today? Typically transgender. Transgender being one word, not two words. Made a stream for once. Yay, Derby Yank. Hello. We're talking about the difference, the science proven difference between sex and gender, and why this is important. Because when people like Ben Shapiro come on and say, oh, I'm on the side of science and transgender people are just biologically impossible, blah, blah, blah. Like, no, it's just misunderstanding the science and not understanding how words work or being deliberately stupid. Yeah, I mean, like, it seems like the reason the term shifted was because transgender seems to be a more accurate term. Transsexual is mostly just like it's one of those terms where like you can still use it. It's just really outdated and kind of it's gonna seem kind of weird, you know. So this is a, you know, the rest of this is really interesting too. Goes into more detail on the individuals interviewed and stuff like that. But basically talking about this Kessler and McKenna study and how it kind of changed the understanding of sex and gender. I love the remixes of him singing WAP. Oh gosh. By the way, guys, I did get slapped with DMCA for the music section that we had the other day, so sorry, we probably can't have more of those. But it was fun while it lasted. Alright, let's take a look at Stanford Medicine. the schmucks at Stanford talking about medicine. Let's see what their research shows here. This is quite a long article. It's basically talking about how sex is important to understanding health. And it's also talking about, oh, you made a playlist of lefty music in the Discord? Awesome. I'll make a music streaming section for people to play, put their music in, and I'll pin that to the top, Let's see. Rather than scampering about, it was 2012 and some of Amy Braun's lab mice weren't behaving normally. This was very exciting. This article's from 2017, the Journal of Sex, Gender, and Medicine. Okay. Rather than scampering about, investigating their surroundings, and introducing themselves to other mice, whiskers quivering, they eschewed social interaction and ran in circles. Placed into a water tank, they appeared disoriented and confused. Unlike their peers, they swam hesitantly along the walls, unable to find and remember the location of a platform hidden underneath the surface. They were pale shadows of their mousy selves. It was exactly what the researchers, who were studying brain development in autism and schizophrenia, had expected to see. But there was just one major hitch. We realized when we looked more closely, says Braun, they were seeing this aberrant behavior only in male mice. The females behaved like our controlled animals. We thought, well, this is sort of weird. Later we realized the weird thing was that we actually looked at the female animals at all. At the time, many researchers focused their studies only on male lab animals, under the belief that the normal hormonal cycling of female animals would render them more biologically variable. They worried that this perceived variability would make it harder to achieve statistical significance in their studies. A 2010 study in Nature found bias toward the use of male animals in 8 out of 10 research discipline. The problem was particularly egregious in Braun's field of neuroscience, in which studies of male animals outnumbered those of female animals nearly 6-fold. Colleagues who saw Braun's data counseled a simple fix: leave out the results on the females. That didn't sit well with Braun, a graduate and student in the laboratory of Theo Palmer, PhD, and associate professor of neurosurgery. I thought, wait, what? This is all biology. Let's figure out what's going on. It's obvious that sex is important in healthcare, and medical research. Women are more likely to suffer from autoimmune diseases, have osteoporosis, and be diagnosed with depression and anxiety. Men are more likely to develop Parkinson's disease and cardiovascular disease early in life. Knowing predispositions like these can help physicians make a diagnosis or researchers develop new therapies. Yet medical research has usually left females out. And an increasing body of research suggests that the influence of a person's biological sex on their health is just the tip of the iceberg. Hovering just beneath the surface is a mixture of behaviors, expectations, cultural norms, and attitudes that together define a given individual's gender. Gender is inextricably linked to sex, but not defined by it. And it indisputably affects health. Boom. This is Stanford, Sex, Gender, and Medicine. Understanding that sex and gender are two different things. Weird how the journal with sex and gender in the title would recognize that these are two distinct attributes. Strange. I know. For example, a 2016 study from a group of Canadian researchers suggested that the successful recovery from acute coronary syndrome, a term describing a blockage of blood flow to the heart as happens during a heart attack, was dependent not on whether the patient was male or female, but rather on each person's gender characteristics. Patients with more traditionally feminine traits, such as responsibility for caregiving, were more likely than those with more traditionally masculine traits, such as being the primary income earner of their households, to suffer another coronary episode or die within the following year, regardless of their biological sex. So again, there's a reason there's a distinction between these things in medical fields. And the reason is gender has an effect on your health, and sex has an effect on your health as well. These two things greatly influence your personal experiences in the world. Government and funding agencies are taking note of this and other examples of gender and sex disparities. The World Health Organization urges the incorporation of gender into healthcare policy worldwide, and in 2010, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research established policies requiring health and medical researchers to include both sex and gender as critical variables in any planned studies or clinical trials, as did the European Commission in 2013. In 2016, the U.S. National Institutes of Health began requiring that grant proposals include information on how sex will be incorporated as a biological variable in research studies, but it has no such requirement for gender yet. Now, again, this is one of those things where, like, the perception among conservative individuals is that the World Health Organization is including transgender people because that's the nice thing to do. That's not why scientific organizations issue treatment protocols. That's not why doctors prescribe treatments. They don't prescribe treatments to be nice. They prescribe treatments that have better outcomes for their patients. I feel like this isn't that hard to understand. But a lot of conservatives tend to think that it's like, oh, you're bleeding hearts. You can't just follow the data. The data indicates that we should treat these two things as different, and that we should prescribe treatments for transgender people. This is why the WHO has their guidelines. This is why the U.S. National Institutes of Health have their guidelines. This is why Europe has their own guidelines as well. That's why all of these institutions treat sex and gender as different things. Both sex and gender influence human health and disease, says Janine Clayton, MD and director of the National Institutes of Health's Office of Research on Women's Health. It is increasingly clear that it is both an ethical and scientific imperative to conduct research and report on the results for both men and women. There's just one tiny little problem, points out Stanford professor of medicine, Marcia Stefanik. We don't know how to measure gender, which, yeah, that'd be a pretty big problem when it comes to science. Director of Stanford's Women and Sex Differences in Medicine, or WSDM, pronounced Wisdom Center. Sex is generally assigned at birth based on exterior genitalia, after which a broad range of biological, particularly reproductive, sex differences are assumed. Individuals are then usually forced into a binary model of gender, with distinct masculine and feminine categories, when the possibilities are much broader and more expansive. Stefanik and Stanford's Londa Scheibinger, PhD, argue that gender is instead a point on a continuum with infinitesimal gradations. Together, they are developing a way to measure gender in such a way that it can be accurately correlated to health outcomes. If successful, their approach could transform how medicine is practiced. Basically, we want to blast the standard attitudes about masculinity and femininity out of the water, says Scheibinger, who is the John L. Hines Professor of History of Science and former director of Stanford's Clayman Institute for Gender Research. We want to get rid of the notion that you can assume there is a prepackaged set of characteristics that belong to men or women. We want to develop a new instrument to measure gender that will allow us to better understand how gender and sex interact to impact health. That's awesome, Serious Twitch. It would be difficult to argue that bronze lab mice have a gender. Most researchers would agree that their behavior is governed primarily by biology rather than the societal expectations of their furry cage mates, or their own mouse-conceived ideas of self. But in people, sex and gender together make up a complex stew of biology and behavior that can be difficult to swallow for researchers who want simple answers. As bronze experience shows, although it's much easier to forge ahead with blinders on, doing so can vastly compromise a study's findings and overlook critical aspects of biology. So, how to proceed? To begin with, it's important to define the terms accurately to avoid confusion. Even many research articles and researchers refer to gender when they actually mean sex. Sex is a biological trait that is determined by the specific sex chromosomes inherited from one's parents. In humans, male sex is determined, with a few exceptions, by the presence of the Y chromosome. A gene on the Y chromosome directs the differentiation of the fetal gonads into testes, resulting into the production of testosterone, which affects many of the body's tissues early in development. People with one X and one Y chromosome, or variants like XX or XXY or XYY, are typically male, while those who have solely X chromosomes are usually female. People have a sex, animals have a sex, all tissues, including the fetal placenta, have a sex, even individual cells have a sex. Gender, on the other hand, is socially, culturally, and personally defined. It includes how individuals see themselves, gender identity, how others perceive them and expect them to behave, gender norms, and the interactions, gender relations they have with others. Often, one's gender aligns with one's sex. Men tend to assume more masculine behaviors and traits, and to be seen as masculine by others around them, for example. But not always. Increasingly, researchers like Stefanik and Scheibinger are realizing that both men and women exhibit a spectrum of gender traits that aren't purely masculine or feminine. So, again, we have yet another reputable scientific journal, published journal from 2017, relatively recently, recognizing that there is a distinct difference between sex and gender. Something that people like Abigail Schreier, who wrote an entire book about how social trends are turning our nation's young women into trans men, and transphobic bigots like Ben Shapiro, when they say, oh, the science is clearly on our side, they're wrong. The science isn't on their side. The reason a published article in the Journal of Sex, Gender, and Medicine can talk in broad terminology like this is that this is the broad consensus in the medical field. This is what medical science is telling us. That there is a difference between these two things, and that difference is very profound and deep and abiding, and that there are problems with measuring it, certainly, but that it has an impact on how health outcomes kind of manifest. So we should be seeking to understand it better. These arguments, people like Ben Shapiro are making diluted conclusions based off their religious framework. It's something I see with young religious Muslims as well. Yeah, I mean, part of it is the religious framework. The other part of it, though, is that there is a motivated reasoning here. Like, Ben Shapiro has a conservative program. He has a motivation to believe that the science is on his side. I also have motivated reasoning in this. I have a motivation to believe that the science is on my side. But in my case, I'm making that assumption based on what medical doctors have told me about my own body, based on what they learned in medical school about the distinction between gender and sex. Because the medical consensus is not something that is made to bend to, the whims of society. The medical consensus is made to treat humans in order to get the best possible outcomes. And these are the realities. And the reality is that sex and gender are different. Let's see. There are many examples of the effects of gender and gender norms on health. It's becoming well known that high-heeled shoes favored by many women can cause lasting damage to the wearer's feet. Other examples are more subtle, such as the fact that American men who conform to what are perceived as traditionally masculine traits may avoid well-care visits with their physicians, drink and drive, engage in risky sexual practices, or take on inherently dangerous occupations. You know, these are gendered things that have an effect on your health. Yeah. I don't think medical schools even go into detail about things like this unless they are actively taking efforts to do so, or electives to do so, which is why there are still very still very conservative doctors. Yeah, especially in research. Well, yeah, this piece even kind of touches on the fact that the term sex and gender, even by researchers, can be used interchangeably. But the fact is, like, just because it's commonly used interchangeably doesn't mean that they are actually interchangeable, you know? So this is another one of those really, really good articles. It goes into some pretty good detail on these things. And it kind of, it arrives at these interesting conclusions. Researchers who have already decided they are going to ignore sex as a variable don't really want to hear about it, she says. People can get defensive, but sometimes I feel like a broken record, asking over and over again when people present their research, did you analyze by sex? Did you look at females? Because again, in the medical field, there's the perception that women or female lab animals are more temperamental, more hormonal, might throw off the data. But you got to look at the data if you're going to draw wider biological conclusions, because we also practice medicine on females and men and women. This is why you have to understand both sex and gender. Yeah. Star Slice, you're absolutely right. The old understanding was that gender wasn't a thing. It was just sex. That's the classic understanding of gender. That's the classic understanding of like the differences between the sexes. But like the previous article we covered, the definition of gender only emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. When people are talking about gender now, gender is like a well-accepted term. But just like 50 years ago, it used to be a new, strange thing. But we know better now. We know more now. Because of science. We know that these two things are distinct. More than once, Amy has stopped me in mid-sentence to say, Theo, sex is a genotype, gender is an identity, says Palmer. Unlike many other researchers, Amy effortlessly reconciles these ideas in her personal and scientific life. Some biologists are so far behind in their social science literacy that the distinction between sex and gender often isn't clear, says Braun. I didn't get any education about this earlier in my grad school career. I kind of stumbled sideways into this issue, and now I can't stop seeing it everywhere. Which is why we're now improving education. This is why people get, this is why medical professionals are supposed to go to conferences. Conferences aren't just like for getting really drunk or schmoozing or hooking up. They're also for modernizing your medical expertise. And this is why we need more people like Braun in the world. Linky RD, I'm sorry you're feeling bad. But don't feel bad. And this was mentioned briefly, but the World Health Organization also recognizes that sex and gender are both important determinants of health. Biological sex and socially constructed gender interact to produce differential risks and vulnerability to ill health and differences in health-seeking behavior and health outcomes for women and men. Dang. The WHO. Just coming right out and saying these are two different things. I guess we can also say that maybe the World Health Organization has been taken over by the trans mob, but I don't think it works that way. Furthering your knowledge as times change should be a requirement for science. I agree. And let's just take a look real quick at the UK. Just real quick. What is the difference between sex and gender? Exploring the differences between sex and gender, looking at concepts that are important to sustained development goals. Let's take a look at the Office for National Statistics from the UK. You know who doesn't make like really radical gendered gestures just to be nice? Statistical analyses. They generally don't be like, yeah, we're going to include trans people to be nice. They're doing it because there's a difference. Let's take a look here. Introduction. This article sets out the interpretation of terms sex and gender, which the Office for National Statistics and UK government bodies will be using to assess how the UK is progressing towards achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Let's see, SDGs are a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. The goals cover a range of areas including health and environment, the economy, and inequalities. Sex and gender are relevant across the SDGs as a whole, but are particularly important for Goal 5, gender equality. As the UK's National Statistics Institute, ONS is responsible for monitoring the UK's progress. Blah, 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 blah. Let's take a look here. Oh, definitions and differences. The UK government defines sex as referring to the biological aspects of an individual as determined by their anatomy, which is produced by their chromosomes, hormones, and their interactions. Generally male or female, something that is assigned at birth. UK government defines gender as a social construction relating to behaviors and attributes based on labels of masculinity and femininity. Gender identity is a personal, internal perception of oneself, and so the gender category someone identifies with may not match the sex they were assigned at birth, where an individual may see themselves as a man, a woman, as having no gender, or as having a non-binary gender, where people identify as somewhere on a spectrum between man and woman. Boom. Wow. Radical notions from the Office for National Statistics in the UK. Yeah, what's amazing is that UK conservatives came up with a lot of this. Yeah. Because they need accurate information on gender and sex. And because they need accurate information, they know that they need to differentiate the two. Because when it comes down to it, gender and sex are two different things, and they have vastly different impacts on society. So, anyway, that has been your lesson on gender, I guess. This is me arguing from facts and using academic papers and studies and scientific information. Please clap. Please clap. Thank you.